You're listening to TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour, with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
When I was a boy, I remember my grandfather picked me up one day and he put me in the car and we drove what seemed like forever, although it really was only just about 11 or 12 hours probably. And we drove to a place called Branson, Missouri. And I mean, it was just awesome. They had everything there you could imagine. I mean, and I remember riding go-karts and going to Silver Dollar City. I remember going to country music shows, and at that time I met Soji Tabuchi, and anybody who knows anything about Branson, you know who Soji Tabuchi is. But at this time, Soji Tabuchi was a young man, and he was living in a pickup truck. And I remember different shows that we went to during the intermission time. Soji would come out and do a little mini show during intermission, or maybe he would come and play part of the show at the very beginning during the warm-up, or maybe there was some type of a little gap in the show where the performers needed to change costumes or they needed to move the set around or something. And so they would pull the curtain and Soji would come out and he would play a number or two, and then the show would resume. And that's what he was doing. He was just a filler guy, and he just drove from show to show to show. He did a little bit part in 3 or 4 or 5 shows every night, and then he would sleep in his pickup truck. But I remember meeting him in the parking lot of the Presley Theater after one of those shows, and seeing the truck that he lived in. And then to see him all these years later now, he's made it. And anyways, Branson was just a great place. I mean, I can remember fishing there. I just fell in love with the place. And so every year, my grandparents would take me back there, and we would have a little mini vacation every summer, and it was just great. In fact, I loved it so much that when I became an adult, I got a timeshare in Branson, and our family every year would go and take a vacation there for a number of years. And I mentioned, of course, in the upcoming interview with Clint Lacy that I haven't been there in about 6 years. It's because I've been living in Florida, and it's just, I did make the drive from Florida early on in moving here. Had to preach in Missouri, and we drove all the way out there, preached a revival in Missouri, and then I had about a week off, and we spent the week in Branson, stayed at a resort there, and then we went to Alabama. I preached a revival there, then I came home, and we loved that vacation. But I've always been fascinated with the Missouri Ozarks ever since I was a boy. In fact, for a number of years of my life, if you would have asked me where I wanted to live, and I'm not just talking about when I was a little kid or even when I was a teenager, I'm talking about as a man in my 20s and still as a man in my 30s. If you would ask me, where do you want to live? If you could live anywhere you could live, where would you want to live? I would have said the Missouri Ozarks. And there's still a part of me that would very much love to live in the Missouri Ozarks today. And even in the last 2 years, though we didn't make the trip, we ended up going to other places. The wife and I had the conversation, and where do we go on vacation? Where do we want to take a trip to? And Branson came up both times, and we came this close for the last couple of years to going to Branson. I know it's a place that I'll go back to. But I'm saying all that to say this: I've been fascinated with the Missouri Ozarks pretty much my whole life. It's a place that's very near and dear to my heart. It's a place that I love to visit. It's just a place that, there are some places in everybody's life, and that's just one of them for me. And so our guest today is Clint Lacy, and I particularly enjoyed our conversation because Clint lives in the foothills of the Missouri Ozarks. And the subjects that we're talking about pretty much took place in the Ozarks and in Missouri. Clint, of course, is a historian. He is a writer. He's on the board of editors for the Barnes Review magazine. Those of you who've listened to TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour for any period of time know that the TBR and TBR Radio Presents is the Barnes Review magazine. And Clint is a writer for the Barnes Review, and also for our other sponsor, the American Free Press. And so Clint and I have worked together, collaborated together in that capacity. And he's an expert on the history of Missouri, and from time to time he writes articles about Missouri. and about the Ozarks. Another thing that's fascinated me about the Ozarks since childhood is the ball knobbers. And here a couple of issues back, Clint wrote a great article on the history of the ball knobbers, and that's kind of what inspired me to ask him to come on to the show today. But we're not going to talk about the ball knobbers today. We're going to talk about them in an upcoming radio show. What we're going to talk about in today's discussion with Clint is his great book, Blood in the Ozarks. And a tremendous massacre. The Union soldiers massacred not just Confederate soldiers, but their families, their wives, their children, their mothers, their grandmothers. On Christmas Day, during a church service. So that just shows you how brutal the Yankees were. We'll also talk about Lawrence, Kansas, and what happened up there and why. We'll talk about Morris Sleeze. Breaking news about Morris Sleeze. Apparently it's coming out in court documents that Morris Sleeze of the Southern Poverty Law Center has attempted to molest his stepdaughter. Actually, it's old news. It's just now coming out. But that's okay. What did Jesus say? He said that the things you hide, the things you do in secret, he said will eventually be shouted from the rooftops. Well, that's kind of what's happening with Morris Sleeze. And so he thought he'd put the lid on this years ago, but those court documents now are beginning to see the light of day. And so Clint was actually the one who kind of broke that story. And so we're going to let him talk about that as well, and some other things here on this week's TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour. So without any further ado, here's our interview with Clint Lacy. So is that a Habitat for Humanity shirt you're wearing, or what is that?
No, that's the hospital where I had my hip replaced.
Okay. So your hip replacement, anterior or posterior? Did they come in from the front or the back?
They came in from the front.
Okay. Because I know there are still a few doctors that come in from the back, and I know that's a lot more complicated than when they come in from the front.
Yeah, I had a buddy that fell walking his dog last winter, and it was icy out, and his dog saw a cat and pulled it on the leash, and he fell down and broke his hip, and his doctor went in from the back, and he had the big log incision and had to dress it every day, and I didn't have to do anything with this one. It seemed like it was a lot less of a hassle and less painful.
Can you center your, you on a laptop? There you go, yeah.
I'm on my phone.
You're on your phone?
Yeah.
Okay. And so tell me about your book, Blood in the Ozarks.
Well, Blood in the Ozarks was a culmination of 10 years of research. Years ago, I guess around 2004, 2005, I was given a speech at Fort Davidson State Historic Site in Pilot Knob, Missouri. And I wanted the speech to focus on why those men fought, why they charged the fort, because it was a Union fort. And it was in 1864, and that was Price's invasion of Missouri. They had 3 or 4 charges across this open field, probably 2 or 3 football fields in length. They outnumbered the Federals, but the Federals had a lot of artillery. And the waves of Confederates that would make it to the fort, there was a moat dug around it. When they would try to climb up it, the Federals, I guess you would say, improvised hand grenades out of, cannonballs. They would put the fuse in, throw them at them. Anyway, it was overwhelming odds, and it would have took a lot of sacrifice if you're across that field, seeing that fort loaded with that artillery, knowing you're probably not going to make it out. So why did they do it? And that research led me to a Reverend Jesse Pratt, who was in the 15th Missouri Cavalry CSA. And it turns out the 15th Missouri Cavalry CSA, Christmas 1863, they were holding, a dinner and preaching. Their commander was Colonel Timothy Reeves, and he was a Baptist preacher in southwest Ripley County, Missouri, not far from Arkansas border. And the Federals discovered where they were at and just came in and slaughtered them, basically. And there were civilians there because the Confederates hadn't seen their family in a while. So in 1864, when Price came to Missouri, there were a lot of people that wanted revenge, not just for that, but for atrocities that had been committed against their families, friends and families, neighbors, whatnot. In Missouri, if you gave aid to a Confederate, whether he was your family or not, and this includes them stopping over for the night and getting a meal, or you sending them a homemade uniform, anything that gave aid, you were targeted. So a lot of homes burned, a lot of people were killed, and there was a large feeling of the need for revenge. Anyway, when I was giving this speech, the director of the fort said, where did you get your information? And I said, well, I got it from a genealogy newsletter. And he said, well, if that information came from Jerry Ponder, it's not correct. So I thought, I got to dig deeper into this. And my research tells me that it did happen. After researching it 10 years, I thought I might as well put this in a book. But the problem was, every time I got ready to put it in a book, I would find something new. So the fear was, if I published it, I would find something else. And finally, the publisher said, "Clint, we gotta publish this thing." So I did, and I've got plans for a second edition of it with more information that I found.
So where do you live? I know you live in Missouri. You've lived there your whole life, but where do you live in relation to the Ozarks?
Well, I'm in eastern Ozark foothills of southeast Missouri. Now, I grew up about, I would say, 25 miles from here in a very unique place because it was just north of what they call the boot heel of Missouri. But 18 miles away was the foothills of the Ozarks. So geographically, it's a very unique place. And I moved here in 2000, and I've grown to like it. I like the hills. I like the foothills. An hour away is the St. Francis Mountains. So I like where I live for a number of reasons.
So you say you grew to like it. Does that mean you did not like it at first?
It's an adjustment. There's quite a bit of differences between what you would call flatlanders and hill people.
Did you ever read The Shepherd of the Hills by Harold Bell Wright?
I never have read it. I have a friend that works in the theater production, if you will, out there. Mm-hmm. He's part of the cast, and I've done research on what they call the Bald Knobbers, but I've never read the book. The
very beginning of that book, it might even be the first paragraph, but it's within the first page or two. And I'm not quoting it exactly because, it's a book that I read 20 years ago. But the line that always stuck with me from that book was at the very beginning was one of the hill people was talking about the land in the Ozarks and how it was the most valuable land anywhere in the world. And he says something to the effect of, because if you were to lay it out flat, you'd have 5 times more of it.
Well, from that perspective, yes. And I guess you could say in modern times, post-Civil War, it really did become valuable for the timber and the minerals that are in it. Now just land itself is valuable in itself. That's a good quote.
But you look at the Ozarks now, and of course I haven't been to Branson in probably 6 years now.
Yeah.
Most of my life I went there at least once a year, but it's been about 6 years since I've been there. Been busy and, living in Florida now, it's when I lived in Texas, it was a convenient enough drive. When I lived in Kansas, it was a convenient enough drive. In Florida, it's just not a very convenient drive.
It's a bit of a drive, isn't
it? and so we've been vacationing in other places, but you go there and it's beautiful, a lot of trees. But you look at pictures of that same area taken as recently as the 1960s. Those mountains were clear cut. There wasn't a tree to be found.
Yeah.
So, that's kind of my answer to environmentalists who say, well, they're cutting down all the trees. They grow back.
Well, in my area, southeast Missouri here, the majority of the trees were pine. Post-Civil War or war between the states, whatever you want to call it. The timber companies came in and clear cut them. They even built railroads out to them so they could harvest them and ship them off. And if you've seen old pictures of this, they even had the workers' houses on the cars, on the railroad cars, and they would set up little temporary towns, and they'd clear cut it all. Nothing left. But what grew back was hardwood, mainly, oak, maple, things of that nature, trees of that nature. But I was reading in a Missouri conservation magazine, they said shortleaf pine was what was native here. It kind of piqued my interest living around here, and they said the shortleaf grows best in rocky, exposed areas. They did some highway work a couple years ago, and a while back, I was driving down the road, and I noticed rocky areas, where they had did earthwork, and there, sure enough, pine trees are coming up.
I know you had mentioned you were giving a talk there. I'm guessing it was probably an SCV event, Sons of Confederate Veterans, or was it something else?
At the time, I was in the League of the South, so It was a league. Yeah, there was, it was a good little crowd that showed up, and something odd about the way the director approached me. Mm-hmm. That's what stimulated me to research it, because it was almost like I was supposed to take his word.
Well,
so in my research, I found that mainly there was two guys that had drug author Jerry Ponder through the mud. They contacted every magazine, every institution they could find to say that this never happened, and they said, here's why. And another big factor to this was Paulette Giles' novel Enemy Women. I don't know if you ever heard of that or not.
No, I've not.
But it came out in 2003 or 2004, and it was a fictional story, but it was historical fiction about a family living in the southeast Missouri Ozarks and what they went through in regard to what the Federals did to them. This woman came and spent a couple weeks with historian Jerry Ponder, and he took her to all the places that she wanted to know about so she could accurately write this novel. One of the critics was a man named Ray Burson, who had, I guess he moved back to Ripley County, Missouri, where all this took place, early to late 90s. He was writing newspapers to kind of sandbag Mrs. Giles. And one of the things he said was, well, she has dual citizenship in the United States and Texas. What does she know about it? That was in a interview he gave to Rutgers University, where he went to college. Well, yeah, she does have dual citizenship, but she was raised in Salem, Missouri. So she was raised in the Ozarks. And the really funny part about this man's criticism is in that same interview in which he criticized her, he tells the interviewers that he grew up in New Jersey and Aruba.
Well, I've been to both, and let's just say that Aruba's a lot prettier than New Jersey.
Yeah. But first thing I thought of, well, who is this guy to criticize her? At least she's from the Ozarks. He was from nowhere near the Ozarks, but
right.
There was only 14 families in Ripley County, Missouri that were pro-union, and Mr. Burson's wife was a descendant of one of them.
Okay.
That was kind of his motivation.
Well, did she wind up in Texas?
Paulette Giles did, yes.
Yes. Did she wind up in Texas? Because I know that that's ultimately where the Missouri government wound up toward the end of the war. It actually wound up setting up its capital.
Marshall, Texas, that's correct.
So is that how she wound up in Texas, or was that a totally different?
I think that's unrelated.
Okay.
She loves horses, and she has a place down there. I believe she's in the San Antonio area down there. So the other critic was a man by the name of Kirby Ross, and he did his attacks online, so to speak, Civil War forums, things of that nature. And anybody that possibly thought that this massacre could have happened, he would attack them viciously, try to belittle them. So I get to researching him, and I come across an article about Major James Wilson. He was the Union officer who led the massacre down in Ripley County on Christmas Day, 1863. And the man that compiled Major Wilson's record at the end, he said, I want to thank Mr. Kirby Ross, who had several ancestors in the 3rd Missouri State Militia Union, for all the information he gave. So, okay, it's not hard to figure out what angle he was coming from. He's carrying water for his ancestors. And he also, there was a bushwhacker named Sam Hildebrand in this area during the war and after the war. And he wrote an autobiography, which actually I don't think Sam could write, but he dictated it to two guys who documented it, and they published it. Well, Ross went through and redid this book, re-edited it, so to speak, and he took every opportunity he could in that book. He put a footnote here, a footnote there, and saying, the Wilson massacre was just a legend. It never actually happened. So it's almost like he re-edited Sam Hildebrand's book just to get that little bit of information in there. So
you had mentioned the critic of the massacre, having an ancestor, who had been there. Did you have any ancestors who were there on the Confederate side?
No, oddly enough, I guess you could blame Franklin Roosevelt for my family coming to Missouri, because we were all from West Kentucky, from the land, what was then the land between the rivers region. Well, when they built the dams, had to go. So my family came to Missouri. Matter of fact, the town my father was born in is under the lake now. No, I didn't have any ancestors there. I did find a Lacy, Lacy, spelled the same way, who was a Confederate down in that area, but to my knowledge, I have no relation to him.
Well, I assume you have to have some Confederate ancestry because you're a member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans.
Yes, that's kind of unique too. I'll try not to spend too much time on it, but when I was in high school, I asked my grandmother, what side did our family fight on? And she kind of thought about it and says, well, I seem to recall the story of an uncle who went to Hopkinsville, Kentucky to join the Confederacy. I said, okay, that explains a lot to me. From an early age, I would look at history books and just kind of naturally be drawn to the Confederate side without really knowing any of the political reasons. So after my grandmother passed, a few years after, I was talking to my great aunt, who's kind of the genealogist in the family, and I asked her about it, and she said, yeah, I have some information on him. Well, his name was William Nathaniel Ingram, and he was my third great uncle and was captured with President Davis in Georgia.
Okay.
And how that came about was when Richmond was falling, Davis left Richmond. I believe their ultimate goal was to try and get to Texas.
See, I was thinking that their goal was to get to the Ozarks and to do guerrilla warfare in the Ozarks, but maybe my interpretation of that was faulty. Because I thought that was Davis's ultimate plan, was that he would move up maybe like into the Appalachians or the Smokies, and if need be, he would continue shifting further west, thinking he could shift even to the Ozarks and, bunker down in the mountains, and that they could basically wage guerrilla resistance for decades if necessary.
Well, I probably need to do some research on that. I had read somewhere that they was trying to establish the capital of the Confederacy in Texas, because Texas was big enough it could be its own country, and there was plenty of men still there. There was plenty of ammunition still there. There's plenty of food there, plenty of artillery there. Whatever the case may be, they left Richmond with an escort of, I believe, around 700 men, and it was drawing too much attention to them. So Davis told one of his aides, pick 10 men with faithful hearts to be my escort. Well, as many people know, President Davis was born in western Kentucky. So of the 10 men, 9 were from West Kentucky and 1 was from Northwest Tennessee. One of them just happened to be my uncle. So that answered a lot of questions for me as to why I just naturally felt drawn to the side of the Confederacy. I never could explain it. In my earlier years, I couldn't explain it. When I got older, upon learning that information, it explained a lot to me.
So did your ancestor ever write anything that you could discover about what happened when Davis was captured?
Not to my knowledge.
The only reason I ask is because there are so many, call them rumors, call them vicious lies, call them tabloid sensationalism, surrounding, there's probably some basis of truth to it. For example, one of the things is that Jefferson Davis was captured wearing his wife's clothing, wearing a dress and so forth, when the reality of that probably just was, in the haste of evacuation, he grabbed the most convenient coat that he could grab, and it was probably his wife's overcoat.
Yeah, I've heard that was just a rumor that was started.
Yeah. But I just wondered if perhaps if your ancestor or one of the other Confederates had ever actually written. It would be interesting to read what the Confederate take was of their capture and their state during it.
Yeah, well, one of the units that was in pursuit of him actually spent a lot of time in southeast Missouri. And it was a regiment from Wisconsin, and they were regular Army. They weren't militia. And a friend of mine wrote a paper on it in college, and what he found was when this Wisconsin regiment was in Missouri, even they disdained the Union militia because they made their jobs so much harder with the cruelty that they were inflicting upon the citizens. They just made enemies of all the citizens.
Right.
It made it harder for this Wisconsin regiment when they came down here. They were very vocal about that. And I believe that same regiment was in pursuit of Davis in Georgia. And somehow or another, I believe it was a Michigan regiment that actually captured him or took credit for it.
Well, one thing that a lot of people don't realize is, and it's not that I'm trying to give the Yankees a pass by any means, because I'm not, but what a lot of people do not realize is that I think one of the reasons that the Yankees were so cruel is this war is sold to us by would-be historians. as it was a conflict brother against brother. But that's not the case. I would say the majority of the Yankee soldiers were either mercenaries or they were immigrants that were pulled right off of the boats in Yankee ports and basically told that they could either join the army or they could get back on the boat and go back to Ireland or, go back to wherever. These Yankees that were coming down, they weren't coming down from Connecticut or Illinois. They were coming in from some foreign country, and like I said, they were mercenary troops or they were just really hungry immigrants who did not have a stake in our war, and nor did they share the common culture that existed before the war, to whatever degree there was a common culture. And so they did not have the moral reservations that, say, soldiers from Connecticut or Rhode Island or Massachusetts or Illinois would have had. And so I think that's part of the reason why the Yankees did come down and really brutalize the South in the way they did.
Yeah, to speak a little more on your point, a lot of the Unionists in Missouri were German, of German descent, and they were called 48ers because they came over here after their failed Marxist revolution. That's what it was. It was a failed Marxist revolution in Germany. They brought their beliefs with them. It's my understanding a German wrote a book as he was traveling. He wrote about Missouri, how much it looked like Germany, and that's what drew him here. I'll just say it like this. I'll pose this question. If they left Germany because they had a failed Marxist revolution and they fully supported Lincoln.
What does that say about Lincoln?
Right.
Pause here for a word from one of our sponsors, a publication near and dear to both Clint and I's hearts, The Barnes Review. If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading The Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
If my ancestor wrote anything down, it's kind of a unique story because my same great aunt that is a genealogist in the family, she was telling me that when she was a child, they would go and visit a woman who was one of his slaves during the war. After the war, all the slaves were freed, and there was one girl who was 15 at the time. She didn't have any place to go and asked if she could stay and help out on the farm. He said yes. Somewhere along the line, she learned how to be a midwife and became independent and was able to move off the farm and delivered nearly every baby in that county. My aunt remembers going to visit her when my aunt was a child. So that kind of breaks the myth that slaves were just property, just something to utilize, because in some aspects they viewed this woman as family, and they would go to visit her. And my aunt remembers that. When you discovered your Confederate ancestor, was that what inspired you to join the Sons of Confederate Veterans and really start researching a lot of these things on a deeper level, or was there something else that brought you to that point? That's a very good question. No, ultimately that was not what inspired me. What inspired me was in 2003 that Governor Bob Holden, there used to be two historic sites in Missouri in which the Confederate flag was flown. One was Fort Davidson and Pilot Knob, and the other was the Higginsville Confederate Cemetery in Higginsville, Missouri. One in southeast Missouri, one in pretty much northwest Missouri. That is the one that got my blood boiling. And there were a lot of other people whose blood was boiling. That's what led me ultimately to the SCV. And we did a lot of work in Missouri. I was also in the league at that time. We kind of started a flag campaign. Anybody that wanted to put up a flag on their business, we'd give them one. And that whole little area of Arcadia, Ironton, and Pilot Knob we had that place covered in flags.
Okay.
But anyway, the short answer is when Bob Holden ordered the flags down, that's when I joined.
So, was there a reason why you left the League of the South, or did the league chapter there just sort of dissolve, or what happened there?
We had a local chapter here, about 5 or 6 guys. In Jackson, Missouri, there's a city cemetery, and when you drive up to the entrance of that cemetery, it's right off a street. There is a large monument there to Confederate Colonel William Jeffers. And the flagpole for the cemetery is right beside it, and not far from that is the grave of William Jeffers. I wanted to put up a Missouri battle flag for Jeffers. So I approached the city as a league member. And you have to understand, a Missouri battle flag.
Is that the blue flag with the red the red corner and the cross on it?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, it is. So not only would it have been the flag he fought under, it's a cemetery, so it also serves as a Christian symbol. So at first the city was 50-50 on it, is what the mayor told me. Well, then the Southern Poverty Law Center put out a hit piece on it, and they used a man by the name of Michael Tubbs as the fuel for this hit piece, saying he hated Jews and he tried to blow up a military installation at some point. So I contacted Dr. Hill and I said, what's the story on this guy? And he said, yeah, he went to prison for that, and he's a reformed man. As a reformed man, we let him back in. I'm like, okay. So I wrote another letter saying that. But ultimately, the reason I left is I felt like they just left us hanging out there. You know, I was getting personally attacked. And
I'll let you in on a little secret. The League of the South is all about making money for Dr. Hill. That's the only reason it exists.
In my opinion, yes.
And that's what it's about. I think he exhausted the true market of Southern patriots, and so now he's selling his wares to white supremacists.
Yeah.
And when he's exhausted that market, he'll move on to wherever he sees the next, how do I say this, assembly of suckers. That's my honest opinion. And by the way, he owes me a bunch of money. I didn't get paid half of what I was supposed to get paid when I worked for him.
Heard similar stories, I'll put it that way. I wasn't really going to go down this road, but since we're there, I'll say this. But he told me one time, Clint, whatever you do not have elections in your chapter. That's why the SCV is in such disarray. They have elections. They're in a constant state of turmoil because of it. But, okay, yeah, even if that is valid, who would it be more valid for? Because he's the chief. He's the one in charge.
Right.
I'm actually the one that gave him the idea. I don't know if you see my dog.
Yeah, I see his nose.
She always has to make an appearance. Where was I at? She totally...
You were saying that he was the chief and he didn't want elections.
Right. And as the chief, I'm pretty sure he was the only paid member. So elections would not be good for him. I remember what I was going to say. I'm the one that gave them the idea for their newspaper. I was like, why don't we start a newspaper of our own? And I heard, that's newspapers are on their way out and never work, blah, blah, blah. Lo and behold, after I left, they put out a newspaper that they're still putting out. So let's just put it this way. We had a parting of ways.
Okay, yeah.
I just felt like I could have easily have done that project on my own without all the baggage.
Right.
I was a member, so I did it, as a member and stuck my neck out, and they just sat back and watched. I mean, that's how I feel about it.
When you had mentioned the project there in Missouri to put up the Missouri State battle flag, and Morris Sleeze had, come at you, the Southern Poverty Law Center had come at you, and so I know that's personal. Here last week in the Dixie Heritage Letter, you had an article, so let's just go ahead and talk about it. For years, we called him Morris Sleeze in the SCV. I don't know if they still do. And I guess he's really earned that nickname because come to find out, he tried to molest his stepdaughter.
Sure did. That's what the court document showed anyway.
Yeah. And you were kind of the one that broke that story, of course. I'm still waiting to see it on CNN. Not that we need to see it on CNN for it to be legitimate. I know better than that. But I'd just like to see them, eat a little crow maybe. I don't know.
It was a learning experience what I went through because the reporter for the paper, they wrote that letter. And then they have their little umbrella alliances, like maybe it was Unitarian or something like that. But the guy was liberal, the pastor was. He wrote his hit piece on me. I was responding to all this stuff. But in the meantime, the reporter, who is now the editor of the Southeast Missouri, Bob Miller, he would run back. He could not just do the research on his own and be objective about it. Anything I said, he would run back to the SPLC. And then he'd repeat what they said. Oh, what's his name? Mark, with the SPLC. Is it Cohen?
I don't remember.
Anyway, my brother emailed the editor and said, "What's the matter with you? Can't you answer a question without running to the Southern Poverty Law Center?" Mm-hmm. Well, I probably wouldn't use him as a source again. And we were, kind of like, "Well, thanks a lot. Now that you've totally killed this project, appreciate that." He emailed Mark, whatever his name was, and he said, "Well, Clint said this." And my brother said, "No, Clint didn't say that. You're lying." And he said, "Oh, I'm sorry." They will lie, and lie some more until you say, "Hey, you said this. I didn't say this. You're lying." "Oh, yeah, I'm lying." But then they'll just keep doing what they're doing. And the reporters, they just take their word as gospel. It's almost like in their contract or their handbook, anybody interview, they got to go to SPLC and get a counterpoint. But I documented all the articles and stuff. Matter of fact, in the article about Morris Sleeze that you ran in your newsletter, there was a link. It's called "Battle at Jackson: How One City Council Basically Turned Its Back on Its Heritage and sided with the SPLC." But there's a lot of interesting things in that link. I'll put it to you that way.
Earlier this week, Jeff Sessions, in one of the few good things he's done since becoming Attorney General. I guess every once in a while he has to do something good so that Trump won't fire him, so that Congress won't impeach him. I don't know. So that people like me will decide to tolerate him for another week. I don't know. But Jeff Sessions had basically called Morris Sleeze and the Southern Poverty Law Center out, and basically said that they themselves were a hate group. Accurate. And that they had basically been able to disguise that fact for a number of years because they were supposed to be the organization calling out the hate groups, when in reality they were the hate group themselves. And he basically said that the FBI wasn't going to use their material anymore, and some other things. The Justice Department wasn't going to use their stuff anymore. And they already responded to that, and they basically said that Jeff Sessions was speaking. I can't remember the group he was speaking to now, but they basically said the group he was speaking to was itself a hate group, and that he is, they basically just threw all the names at him like sticks and stones, anti-Semite and homophobe and xenophobe, misogynist. They just threw it all out there at him, thinking that was gonna deflect, and maybe it will. I don't know, because obviously we know where the media stands in all of this stuff. But
you go back to Morris Sleeze's roots. He started off defending the Klan, taking Klan money,
right,
and that was no longer profitable. He started defending people who were quote unquote victimized by the Klan, and he realized that was really lucrative. So I believe in the article I said that SPLC would have us believe that there's a Klansman behind every tree and a Nazi at every podium. That's kind of their strategy. Everybody's either Klan or Nazi, especially if you don't agree.
On that note, we're going to pause here for a brief word from another one of our sponsors, a publication that Morris Sleeze absolutely hates, the American Free Press.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States, the things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. AFP is employee-owned and has been so since its founding. Because of that, AFP never has and never will allow advertisers or special interests or big money to dictate what appears in the pages of the American Free Press newspaper. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed by the big money controlled media monopoly. And that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net.
Let's get back to Blood in the Ozarks. I know you had talked about there was this tremendous massacre at the fort, and you had spoken about that, and how there was a great desire to have revenge. You know, even like Quantrell and that. You know, a lot of what happened in Kansas, Lawrence, Kansas, and so forth, was revenge, basically, on the part of Confederates. A lot of the guerrilla warfare was the exacting of revenge for what the Yankees were doing to their families and to the civilian populations.
Right. What was going on in the Little Dixie area of Missouri, which is the counties along the north side of the Missouri River, pretty much between just west of St. Louis to east of Kansas City, in that area, was their families were being terrorized, just like the families here in southeast Missouri were being terrorized. It was the same thing. And ultimately, the reason they attacked Lawrence, Kansas was because the Federals had enacted this policy. They were arresting all the women in Quantrell's men's families, and they locked them up in a makeshift jail in Kansas City. Now, this jail shared a wall with another building. I think the youngest girl there was 12, and they put her on a ball and chain for sassing. But there's an author by the name of Paul Peterson who wrote 3 books on Quantrell and documented them thoroughly. And he makes a very convincing case that the Federals had been undermining that wall the whole time them girls were there. That was the reason the jail collapsed and fell in on. They made it collapse. When this happened, Quantrell's men pretty much demanded they get revenge. So they went to Lawrence, the source of most, if not all, of their grief. Lawrence was another target because when the Jayhawkers would burn and pillage a Missouri farm, they would even take the tombstones out of the family cemetery. Everything of value went to the center of Lawrence where it was auctioned off. People bought these tombstones to use as front porch steps. Now that tells the how much morality they had, I guess you could say. So when they went into Lawrence, they had a targeted list, and the only time they deviated from that list is if they saw tombstones as front porch steps. Then that building got burned. That house got burned. The mainstream history will tell you 300 buildings were burned in Lawrence, and what Mr. Peterson discovered from one of Lawrence, Kansas's own travel brochures at the time was that only 80 buildings were burned, and that Quantrell exercised, great restraint, kept his men in line. Yeah, I'm sure it was bad. If you look at what they did to their families, what the Jayhawkers did to Quantrell's men's families, you might even say that Quantrell was lenient on Lawrence. So the same thing that's going on in that area of Missouri was going on down here. What provoked the Union to raid Colonel Reeves' camp in Ripley County was on December 23rd, they captured a whole company of that militia's men in Centerville, Missouri, and they took them with them, and they was being held as prisoners. Some say so Reeves could exchange them for some of his men that were captured. It didn't take long for Major Wilson to be on the track of Colonel Reeves. And as I stated, Reeves was a Baptist preacher. They were having a dinner, Christmas dinner, and he was going to preach after the dinner. The pickets were quickly ran in, and they just rolled over them and rode into camp and started killing. You know, these men, their arms were stacked. Hardly anybody had their arms on them. And some of the critics that say this didn't happen, one excuse they use is, well, that would have shown great cowardice on Colonel Reeves' men, showing that they didn't fight. Well, no, it doesn't show great cowardice. It shows that they expected the enemy to respect Christmas Day like all civilizations did.
Right.
You know, and they didn't. And so the number is around 60, give or take, men, women, and children killed. Of course, some people say, well, where are the bodies? But in my research, there was an Arkansas newspaper that published a series of articles by a man named C.G. Johnson, for the good old days. He wasn't at the massacre, but he knew people that were at the massacre, and he said after it was all over that people took the bodies home. People came and got the bodies.
Right.
And took, yeah, okay. So that explains why there's not a mass grave. They say right around 60 civilians were murdered that day. And what Jerry Ponder said, those that weren't killed outright were either died on their way to Pilot Knob, which was like 100 miles north, 120 miles north, or they died in one of the prisons in St. Louis or Alton, Illinois.
So have you met Jerry Ponder? Do you have a relationship with him, or have you just validated his research?
He died in 2005. But shortly before he died, I was able to talk to him on the phone. I said, can you send me some of the documents you found? And he said, yeah. His story was that there used to be two libraries in Donovan, Missouri. There was a city library and a county library. And they consolidated them in the early 90s. And Mr. Ponder seen them throwing away a lot of stuff in a dumpster. And he thought there might be something of value in there. And he found portions of two articles. One was called Donovan, No Man's Land in the Civil War, written by T.O. Wright as a high school paper in 1921, I believe, or 29. I believe it was 21. And he mentions it in there, and he cites longtime residents of the area in his paper. Now, another version of that came out in the 1970s in a newspaper in the area, and he didn't mention the massacre. So the critics say, well, why did he mention it then and didn't mention it in the newspaper? I don't know. That's the short answer. I don't know. Maybe the editor didn't want it in there. Maybe Wright, in his older years, didn't want to offend any of the families.
Well, you and I both write for newspapers, and so we both know that the articles that we submit and the articles that end up in the paper are often very different.
Yeah. There's a lot of creative license taken just in the editing.
Yes.
And then the other paper was The Time of the War, as told by Lindsay Dudley, who was a Confederate veteran, to Dr. Hume. And he talked about the massacre happening. And there's a controversial figure in this story named Colonel W.H. Ryder. He says Ryder was a colonel, commanded a local militia. The critics say that he never was a colonel. But whatever information Jerry Ponder found was good enough for the VA to provide a Confederate tombstone for him. And we both know that you have to submit very detailed information to get one of those tombstones.
Right.
And Burson, the man I mentioned earlier, critic, he went so far as to write the VA, and he posted this online, and say, we need to take this tombstone down. You know, and he was mad when the VA told him to go take a hike. We have no reason to question Mr. Ponder's research. So if this all sounds a little confusing, it can be. It's like a story within a story.
So how does one get a copy of your book, Blood in the Ozarks?
You can go to Amazon and just search Clint Lacy, Blood in the Ozarks.
Okay.
And you can also go to barnesreview.org, and it's in the book section there. Just search Clint Lacy, and you'll find it.
Clint, but that's okay. We'll get him back. In the meantime, let's hear a little word from our good friend, Ben Jones.
Breaker one. Might be crazy, but I ain't dumb. Crazy Cooter coming at you. Hey, y'all, got your ears on? Well, I got some news for you. We're here at our brand new Cooters in the Country store in Sperryville, Virginia. Good old Sperryville, where Cooters started many years ago. Folks are coming from all over Hazard County, and we're going to have a grand old time with good music, good food, and best of all, good friends. Hope y'all can be there. Whoop, here come Enos. Huck got Cletus with him. I'm down and I'm gone.
Yes, Clint Lacy back on the line, and the question that he's answering now is whether or not there was anything that he wanted to add to the discussion about his book, Blood in the Ozarks.
The only thing I'll say is it's a story of two wars.
Mm-hmm.
One that happened in the 1860s, and the other that happened at the turn of the century, of this century. One war was fought with weapons, and the other one was fought with words. And historian Jerry Ponder's critics were even attacking him when he was dying of cancer. I think ultimately he died of a heart attack. Mm-hmm. When Burson wrote me and said, why doesn't Ponder ever reply to me? I said, well, he's got cancer. And well, Ponder's been playing this cancer bit for years. All I want to say is it's a story about two wars. The Civil War, war between the states, war of Yankee aggression, however you want to call it, and the War of Words, in which words were used as weapons, and these two gentlemen would try and destroy anybody who said this massacre happened.
The first of 3 interviews that I recorded with Clint Lacy. Of course, in this interview, as you know, we were discussing his great book, Blood in the Ozarks, some of the other things that happened there in Missouri. And, of course, our conversation kind of went in a number of directions there, but that's okay. It was all good stuff. Our next couple of interviews with Clint, and I'm not for sure exactly when they'll air, but they'll be coming on in the upcoming weeks. And they will be one of them will be a discussion of Jesse James. Of course, anyone from Missouri would have some motivation to study the life of Jesse James. And we'll talk specifically about how Jesse James faked his own death, something that Clint wrote about in the Barnes Review not too long ago. And we'll also discuss in another interview the ball knobbers and vigilante justice in the Ozarks after the war between the states. Both discussions that you'll want to take part in. And so I know that you'll be tuning in the coming weeks to hear those. But until then, why don't you go to Clint's website? It's bloodintheozarks.wordpress.com. Or you could just type Clint Lacy, Blood in the Ozarks, into your Google or Bing search engine, and all kinds of great websites come up. Clint's Facebook page will come up. The Blood in the Ozarks WordPress page will come up. And some other pages will come up as well. That'll kind of give you an opportunity to get to know a little bit about Clint and his book, so I encourage you to do that. I'd also like to encourage you to go to my website, www.dixieheritage.net, and when you're there, check out the website, of course, check out the bookstore, buy a book. Please, buy a book. Buy a DVD, because your doing so is what enables us to stay on the air and to keep bringing these programs to you week after week. It's what keeps us in business, basically. But, show your support, please. It enables us to do what we do. It enables us to stay out there on the front lines fighting for our heritage. But also, use the contact form. Send me an email. I want to hear from you. I want to know who you are. I want to know how you're listening to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. I want to know what your particular interest in our heritage are. And if maybe you've written a book, or maybe you're doing something advocating for our heritage out there in the fight, in the culture war, let me know that, and maybe I'll have you as a guest here on TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. Also, when you're there, if you haven't done so already, sign up for a free copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. And when you do, we'll send you the weekly Dixie Heritage newsletter. Then go to another website, www.barnesreview.org, and check out the Barnes Review. It's the magazine that Clint had written several of his historical articles in. It's also, the Barnes Review is the publisher for Clint's great book, Blood in the Ozarks, and it's a place where you can go to get some great historical information. The Barnes Review, of course, politically incorrect journal of historical thought. You want to check it out. It's a great resource. And I just want to thank you for being our listener once again to here at TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. And so we're just humbled every week that you choose to make us a part of your week. And we thank you for doing so. So until next week, I'm going to leave you with a new song from our friend John Schneider. It's called A Little More Trouble. John has been sending us the cuts from his new CD series, The Odyssey. As you know from our earlier interview with him back in, I believe it was February, he discussed that his goal is to put out 52 songs in 52 weeks during the year 2018. And he sends those to us, and we normally don't have time to broadcast them. But we do have a little bit of time left at the end of today's show, so I'm going to leave you with A Little More Trouble.
I made it through a Gulf Coast hurricane, a California earthquake that rattled my brain. But I think I got myself into one this time. She's a little more trouble than I had in mind. A little more trouble than I had in mind. This girl is so good looking that the men all stare. It's getting harder to act like I don't care. Even my best friends are trying to make some time. She's a little more trouble than I had in mind. A little more trouble than I had in mind. Well, she's a little bit more trouble than I've had with a woman before. Sweet on the vine, like a wild honeysuckle, like a honeybee. I was gonna steal me some loving before long, be gone, ease on down the line. She's a little more trouble than I had in mind. A little more trouble than I had in mind. Well, I talked to her daddy, said, what can I do? He said, son, her mama was just like that too. I was looking around until she struck me blind. She was a little more trouble than I had in mind. A little more trouble than I had in mind. You know her brothers don't like me, I can see it in their eyes. They're looking like a couple of dangerous guys. It ain't my fault, I can't leave her behind. She's a little more trouble than I had in mind. A little more trouble than I had in mind. She's a little bit more trouble than I've had with a woman before. She's sweet on the vine, like a wild honeysuckle, like a honeybee. I was gonna steal me some loving before long, be gone, ease on down the line. She's a little more trouble than I had in mind. A little more trouble than I had in mind. Thought I'd be the lover and then leave them kind. But she's a little more trouble than I had in mind. A little more trouble than I had in mind. A little more trouble. There goes a little more trouble. She's quite a lot of trouble. Yeah, I like that trouble. She's a little more trouble than I had in mind. Stay off the internet from this time on.
on a 2-night Bahamas Paradise cruise from just $149. Cruise and Bahamas resort stay options also available at amazing prices. Call 800-814-7100. That's 800-814-7100.